sit down.
Gary, you can give me the thumbs up whenever we're ready. Boker Tov, friends. I'd like to invite everybody to take a seat. Please turn off your cell phones, put your tray tables in an upright back position. It is wonderful to see all of you this morning, and it is wonderful to have those who are live streaming with us this morning as we have our first in-person Exploring the World of Judaism in a couple years. I don't know if you knew this, there was a pandemic that's still happening. But it is wonderful for us to be together, to learn and to grow and to experience Judaism in this way. So I'm so glad that you are here. This is our inaugural Pearl and Leonard Rosenthal weekend speaker, and we are grateful to them, and they're leaving a legacy here at Shir Hadash through adult learning. And I am pleased to introduce our speaker this morning, Mark Oppenheimer. Mark is the author of 5 books, including Knocking on Heaven's Door, American Religion in the Age of Counterculture, and the newest Jewish encyclopedia, which he spoke about last night. He was a religion columnist for the New York Times from 2010 to 2016. He's written for the New York Times Magazine, GQ, Mother Jones, The Nation, and The Believer. He is also the host of Tablet Magazine's podcast Unorthodox. He has taught at Stanford, he's taught at Wellesley and Yale, and he lives with his family in New Haven, Connecticut, and he has some roots here in the Bay Area with cousins and friends, and we are so thrilled to have him here this morning as he talks about a book that he recently published on the Jews of Squirrel Hill and the Pittsburgh shootings that happened a couple years back. So it is my pleasure to introduce Mark to the Bima.
Thank you so much. It's such a great honor to be here again for my third discussion of this weekend. And I do want to say it's great to, everywhere I go, it seems, I'm so lucky to have so much family, and Fred and Sharon Half came out today, my cousins, which is just fabulous. And I know there are at least a couple more Pittsburghers in the audience because I've met them over the past couple days, and your shirt is going to be Exhibit A when we get to it in a moment. It's actually in the book. So things always go the Pittsburgh diaspora is astonishing, and sometimes people say, why is it I'm always meeting people from Pittsburgh? And I say, well, it's because you are always meeting people from Pittsburgh. The city lost half its population in the 1970s and 80s. Where do you think they went? They went out into diaspora, and you're always meeting them. But one of the upsides is you write a book about Pittsburgh, and everywhere you go, the Pittsburghers turn out, which is just, and they're fundamentally decent human beings. So it's nice to see them. I want to thank Rabbi Schwartz. I want to thank the generous donors who endowed our event today. I also want to make a comment that has little to do with Pittsburgh, but that occurred to me as I go to yet another congregation and yet another community that is, in many other cases, coming together for the first time in person in a long time. And I know that this is not exactly the first event, but for many people everywhere I go, there are always people for whom this is the first event where they've seen friends, family, fellow congregants in a long time. And that's always very moving for me. I remember when the pandemic started, I was in a conversation with some fellow, there were some communal leaders there, there were some journalists there, and I remember one particular woman who has a terrific track record of getting things right, so that when she says something bad is happening, you really worry because she's actually the kind of person who predicts bad things successfully. And she said, you realize a lot of our institutions are going to fail during the pandemic. She said, an enormous number of our summer camps will close, congregations will close or merge, memberships will plummet, and she had a very, very, very draconian view of what was going to happen. And again, this is someone who gets these things right much more often than I do. I'm a terrible prognosticator. If you want to know who's not going to be president, ask me during primary season which of the candidates I think is going to be. I thought John Edwards was a clear, obvious winner of the Democratic nomination. I get everything wrong. And she gets everything right. But in this case, I said, I don't think so. I said, I actually think that even if this lasts 3 years, which was sort of the outermost limit of possibility that epidemiologists were saying, I remember they said, this will be a 1-year pandemic, a 2-year, or a 3-year. We don't know. I said, even if this lasts 3 years, I think our communities are resilient enough and strong enough and also generous enough because, of course, summer camps had no revenue for a summer or two, right? They needed donors to make up that revenue. I said, I think that these Jews and these Jewish communities are resilient enough that actually almost nothing will close. And it turns out I was right. It turns out she was wrong, and I was right. And I haven't called her to the mat on that. I haven't said I told you so. But for once, I was right. And it turns out that congregations are bouncing back, robustly, and memberships held steady, and donations held steady, and more important, solidarity, communal solidarity held steady. So I see that everywhere I go. I've probably been to more congregations than almost any other American for the last 6 months. I've been to about 40 since October. So I know of which I speak, and you guys are terrific evidence of that. And of course, a lot of that comes from the leadership of people like Rabbi Schwartz. So what I want to do today as we talk about Pittsburgh is I'm going to tell you where I was October 27th, 2018, the morning of the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history. I'm going to tell you how I came to write this book. And then I'm going to tell you about a few moments in the book, a few characters whom I sort of think of when I think of all the people, the hundreds of people I met in Pittsburgh. And then we're going to leave a lot of time for questions because wherever I go, the Q&A period is always the most interesting and fun and fruitful for everyone concerned. So I'm going to talk for maybe 25 minutes, and then I want to take, at least as long for your questions, if that's agreeable to everyone. October 27th, 2018 was a fairly brisk morning in Newton, Massachusetts, where I was with my eldest daughter, Rebecca. She is a devoted camper at Camp Ramah, New England, in Palmer, Massachusetts, where this summer she'll be there for her, she started when she was 7. So this will be her, and she's 15, so, do the math. 9th summer, I guess. And yes, because inclusive of the 7-year. And one of the things about being a Camp Ramah camper is that you get invited to a lot of bat mitzvahs. And her region of Camp Ramah goes from Massachusetts down to suburban Washington. And I said, I can't take you to Virginia 9 times for bat mitzvahs this year. I said, but we can do anything. Boston, we live in Connecticut. We can go to all of those if you want. We were there for the bat mitzvah of a good friend of hers. We were inside Temple Emmanuel all morning from about 9:30 until 1 through the lunch. And it was Temple Emmanuel in Newton is a huge temple, and they need to double or triple up every weekend for bar and bat mitzvahs. And so this was a double b'nai mitzvah. There was a boy, and then there was a girl, and then a boy whom she may or may not have known, not her relative, just another boy who got that weekend. By the way, they have 3 Devar Torahs at these services. Each child gets to give one, and then the rabbi also gives one. So you learn a lot of Torah, maybe more than you wanted. And so there were hundreds of people there because each of the 2 children had a whole, each of them had 100 or 200 people there. And so it occurred to me afterwards that given that there was a reception, a luncheon, a kiddush afterwards with 300 or 400 people, somebody had their phone open and knew what was going on in Pittsburgh, but nobody talked about it. My daughter and I left our phones in the car to respect Shabbat, but not everyone does. So somebody knew. And I'm always very moved in retrospect to think that people did not begin spreading it like wildfire. People let these 2 kids have their morning without making it all about, did you hear what's happening in Pittsburgh, and opening their phones. And I know that because when we got out to our car in the parking lot at about 1 o'clock, We had no idea what had happened. And I remember my shock when I did open my phone to see if my wife had texted us about anything. And I saw all these text messages. Are you going to Pittsburgh? Did you hear about Pittsburgh? Don't you have family in Pittsburgh? And I thought, why are all these people asking me about Pittsburgh? And then I navigated over to a news app and saw what had happened. And I must have looked very stricken because Rebecca said, Dad, what happened? And I said, there was a shooting at a synagogue. Jews were killed in Squirrel Hill. And she said, Dad, Squirrel Hill, isn't that where we're from? And I said, well, in a sense, yes. Because although my daughter is quite emphatically not from Squirrel Hill, she grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, and I'm from Springfield, Massachusetts, she knew, I guess, that her grandfather, my dad, Tim Oppenheimer, was from Squirrel Hill, and even had a sense, I think, that his father and his father had also been from Squirrel Hill, and that they were the third through fifth generations of Oppenheimers to be in Pittsburgh, and they had been in Squirrel Hill since there was a Squirrel Hill. It was founded around the time of World War I as a community. And as I began to reflect on these murders, right, this horrible occurrence in which 11 of the 22 people inside the building were killed. There were 22 people inside the building that morning, 21 Jews and an Italian-American custodian named Augie Siriano, who got out alive. And of the 22 people inside, 11 were murdered and 2 others were very badly wounded. As I began to reflect over the next few days, I realized that I wanted to go as a journalist and do something there. And I furthermore began to realize that what I wanted to do was not write about the killer, which is the first thing that a lot of people ask, is, well, you're going to go write about who did this horrible thing. I actually had no interest in who did this horrible thing. And I never have much. I mean, his name, as far as we know, he has not been convicted, so we'll say alleged killer, but the evidence is strong. He was shot by police as he was spraying machine gun fire in the building. His name is Robert Bowers. We know some things about him and how he grew up and his own sad life. But I realized I had no interest in trying to understand the very sick, demented corner of the white supremacist, racist, anti-Semitic internet that had shaped his thinking. And that, in fact, I also had no interest, interestingly, in the 11 who were killed, each of whom was probably a beautiful soul who deserves a book of his or her own. But rather what interested me was, in fact, this thing that my daughter intuited, which was that we have a connection to the neighborhood. And although there have been a number of books written about mass killings in America, of which there have been hundreds since Columbine in 1999, there had never been a book about how it affects the neighborhood fabric where it happens. And it occurred to me that Squirrel Hill was a very interesting place to look at in that regard, because not only is it a neighborhood where I have ancestral ties, so I had personal connection, but it's also the oldest stable Jewish neighborhood in the country. It's been about a third Jewish for about a century exactly. So since it was founded around the time of World War I, it has been between 25 and 35% Jewish every time they've done a population survey. That makes it very unusual because most Jewish neighborhoods rise and fall, or fall and rise. Some places have gotten way more Jewish over time. So you look at some of the New Jersey suburbs like Teaneck and Tenafly and Fort Lee, which have become very substantially Jewish, but didn't used to be. Lakewood, which used to be largely Gentile, and has become very Jewish. Then you look at places that used to be extremely Jewish, like the Lower East Side of New York, where my wife is from, where she's a third-generation child of the Lower East Side. And when my father-in-law was growing up there, it was, well, around the time he was born, it was the largest concentration of Jews in the world. He wasn't born in 1920, but in 1920, there were 500,000 Jews on the Lower East Side. And now there's still a lot, there are several tens of thousands, but it's a percentage of what it once was. For a Jewish neighborhood to be stable in terms of its Jewish population is very, very rare. And Squirrel Hill's unique in that way. So I wanted to find out what happens to a community, especially one that has deep intergenerational Jewish continuity, when a terrible thing happens. What happens when one of the worst things you can imagine comes to one of the best places you can imagine? How do they respond? What can we learn from that response? So I began traveling to Squirrel Hill a few weeks after the killing, and I ended up going 32 times between October of 2018 and March of 2020 when COVID descended across the land. That, by the way, was entirely coincidental. I had bought my last plane ticket. I bought some tickets in bulk when I found a cheap fare. And the last one I'd bought out of Logan Airport, there was a $99 fare if you left at 6 in the morning or something. The last one I'd bought was March 13th or 14th or something like that. And I said to my wife, this was a few months beforehand, that's the last trip I'm going to take. At that point, I'll have gone almost 3 dozen times. I'll have interviewed hundreds of people. I need to start writing. And as it happened, that was about the last flight you could take because they were shutting down flights that week. So what I ended up finding, and the story I ended up telling, is the story of not the killer or the dead, but the concentric circles around them. How do people react who are not necessarily immediately implicated by a mass killing, but nevertheless connect to it in some way? The people who go on the Shiva calls, the people who clean the bodies, who do tahara on the bodies, the people who bake the challahs, I talked to someone who organized healing practitioners, yoga practitioners, Reiki practitioners, therapeutic touch, acupuncturists, to help neighborhood people who were feeling trauma after the event. People who didn't necessarily know any of the dead, but somehow felt that it had affected them because in this neighborhood of less than 3 square miles, it affected everybody. And what you end up seeing is all of these extraordinary serendipitous connections that you never would have predicted or known about from the mass media that comes for a day or two and then leaves. So I want to read you one passage just to give you a sense of how these people that you never hear about or think about end up having these significant relationships to the event. Some of you might remember a man by the name of Greg Zanis. He ran a national nonprofit called Crosses for Losses, which he was a retired carpenter from Aurora, Illinois, who would drive to sites of mass killing and plant white crosses in the ground in honor of the dead. And that's all he did for 25 years, was drive around the country with his pickup truck with his crosses. So this is the story of how he bumped into a woman named Tammy Hepps, who is a Pittsburgh Jew who did not go to Tree of Life. She went to a different synagogue, but in the hours after the killing, she was incredibly involved in. She was at the JCC, consoling some of the family members. She was outside Tree of Life saying psalms, right? Because you're supposed to, keep the dead bodies company by saying psalms until they're interred. She helped draft a letter to President Trump that Bend the Arc, the progressive Jewish organization, drafted, asking him not to come. She was like a whirlwind, a dervish of energy. And this is the next day. This is Sunday. She's finally going home to get some sleep. When Hepps made a turn onto Murray Avenue, a truck pulled up in front of her. On the side of it were painted 3 curious words: crosses for losses. As Hepps remembered it, she looked into the truck and saw a pile of crosses in the back. They were all white, and on quick count, she decided there were 11 of them. And soon she grasped what she was seeing, and she was incensed. I thought to myself, Hepps told me, you have got to be fucking kidding me. And I looked around and no one else was there, and I thought, if I have to be the one to tell this man he can't put crosses on the synagogue, I will be the one to tell him he can't put crosses on the synagogue. Hepps had no idea who this guy was with this kind of nerve. As she was figuring out what to say to him, she saw on the front seat of his truck a pile of wooden 6-pointed stars. She was relieved. I thought, okay, what will happen is he's going to put the Stars of David on the crosses and it will all be okay. Greg Zanis got out on the driver's side of the truck and approached Hepps. She looked him up and down. He was tired, unshaven, old. What was he doing here? Where had he come from? Then she looked down and saw his hands, and something became clear. I saw his hands were covered in white paint, Hepps remembered. It's like he painted these things overnight and didn't even have time to wash. He told me his intention. He said to me, I made these things and I got in my truck and I drove 9 hours. There was white paint on his hands. He said to me, I've been driving the whole time. I don't even know the names of the people who died. I have to write their names on the stars. And then Tammy Hepps knew what she had to do. Her mother had emailed her the full list of names that morning, so she had the names on her phone. Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irv Younger. I brought up this list on my phone and he said to me, can you please write the names in my notebook? I was shaking as I copied these names into his notebook so he could write the names on the stars. When Heps had written down all 11 names, she gave Greg Zanis' notebook back to him, and now she had a question for him. I said to him, "Why do you do this?" He said that there had been gun violence in his family, and this was his response. He said to me, "Do you remember Parkland? I did that one. Remember Columbine? I did that one too." It had never occurred to me, Heps said, that it was one person who had made it his life's work to drive around the country and do this. And at that moment, I realized we were just another one on the list. So that's the kind of thing that happens in the aftermath of a mass killing, is people, curious characters with the best of intentions, come to town. What else happens in the aftermath of a mass killing that you might not know if all you did was watch Anderson Cooper, right? Well, one of the things that happens is people design beautiful things. Public art always arises out of the ground almost in the aftermath. A graphic designer named Tim Hines, not Heinz like the ketchup, which is a very big Pittsburgh company, but Hines, H-I-N-D-E-S, Heinz. A lapsed Lutheran, German-American, no relationship to the Jewish community, Gentile guy, graphic designer, lived in the south suburbs of Pittsburgh, was driving home in his car and listening to the radio about the killing, and he thought, I have to do something for the Jews. So he gets home, he fires up his Macintosh, and he says to himself, I want to design something that reflects the Pittsburgh embrace of its Jewish population. So he thinks, what's more Pittsburgh than the Steelers? So he pulls up the Steelers logo. And he tinkers around with it, and he takes the yellow element. If you can picture my friend with the T-shirt, where'd he go? Baby. When he comes back, we have someone wearing the T-shirt here. He takes if you picture the Steelers logo, there's a yellow, red, and blue geometric shape. There's a bonus prize for anyone who knows what the geometric shape is called. What are those three things? They look sort of like stars, but they're not. They're a form of asteroid, geometrically speaking, that's called a hypocycloid. I learned that when I was writing the book. Geometers in the audience will be pleased I get that right. He took the yellow hypocycloid at the top and replaced it with a yellow Star of David. And then he replaced the word Steelers with the words stronger than hate. And he posted it to Facebook. He just thought, well, here's a little image. And within a few hours, it had gone around the world approximately 8 trillion times, give or take. The next day, that element was being held up on posters at the Pittsburgh Steelers game. The day after that, it was in storefronts all up and down the Forbes and Murray Avenues business corridor in Squirrel Hill. The Pittsburgh Steelers wore it on their cleats. You saw it on babies' onesies. You probably saw it on cloth diapers. You saw it on dog sweaters that people put their little dogs in. It was everywhere. It became the dominant graphic image of the killing. And again, created by someone who was not a Jew, who was not even from Squirrel Hill, but was kind of from the outer rim, from the south suburbs, and wanted to do something. I think about Rose McKee, an African-American woman from the Twin Cities, who made it her practice, starting a few years ago, to bring sweet potato pies to places where there had been great grief. And she thought, well, as an African-American, the sweet potato pie is a symbol of our culture. I want to bring it as a gift to people from other cultures. Now, here's what's extraordinary. Rose McKee knew, as an older black woman, and she knew somewhere in her consciousness that if you're bringing food to Jews, you can't just cook it in your own oven. You actually have to be mindful of the fact that they have special dietary restrictions. And you have to cook it in a sort of Jewish way. Wait, there's my guy with the T-shirt. Could everyone turn around and see the symbol? Wait, stay right there. You with Ariella, stay right there. There we go. So you see the two hypocycloids, the blue and the red, and then you see the one on top, which is typically a yellow hypocycloid, is replaced by a Star of David, and then where it says stronger than hate, that's where the word Steelers would normally go. But you see this T-shirt at least as much as you see the other Steelers T-shirt these days. All right, thank you. You were dismissed. All right. See, I don't even have to bring the poster. There's always somebody. It's often on a yarmulke. You'll often see that symbol on a yarmulke now. Anyway, so back to Rose McKee in the Twin Cities. She had this idea that if you want to bring sweet potato pies to Jews, they had to be cooked in a Jewish way. So this is what this woman did. She went to the Jewish day school I think in St. Louis Park, whichever of the Twin Cities suburbs the Jewish day school's in. And she said, I want to make some sweet potato pies for Jews in Pittsburgh. May I use your kitchen? And they said, oh, of course. And they told her how to, get the right ingredients and use their kitchen and make kosher sweet potato pies for the Jews of Pittsburgh, which she then took in an airplane and flew to Pittsburgh to give them in, I believe it was December, a couple months after the killing. So some people do public art, some people bake. There was a group from Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh that baked hundreds of challahs, which they then gave to the Hillel educator, Danielle Kronyach, and she then delivered them anonymously to the front stoops of people in Pittsburgh who she thought might need some warm bread to comfort them. Bread, food, that's one of the other ways that people help each other in the aftermath of a mass killing. One of the interesting things that happens is a lot of people want to give money. They can't come, but they want to give money. So a lot of people went to they Googled Pittsburgh Jewish, and they found the email of the Jewish Federation or the website, and they went and donated money to the Federation. But a lot of people found the GoFundMe campaign set up by Sheikh Khatiri, an Iranian-American lapsed Muslim exchange student living in Washington, D.C., going to Johns Hopkins University's programs there. It's a guy in his late 20s, again, Muslim, aspiring American citizen, loves the Jews. Has had many Jewish mentors, many Jewish supporters in America, couldn't believe someone would do this to the Jews. He woke up that morning in Washington, found out what had happened, went to his coffee shop, went to GoFundMe.org, and set up a page saying, give money here to support the Jews of Tree of Life. The CNN anchorman Jake Tapper saw it and retweeted it. Some other people picked it up. It went viral. And within a week, he had raised over $1 million, becoming the largest single-person fundraiser for the Jews of Tree of Life and their families in the entire world. Again, a lapsed Muslim, non-Jewish, Gentile, non-American, with a green card or a student visa, living in Washington, no relationship to the Pittsburgh community, raises this kind of money. So some people do graphic art, some people bake sweet potato pies, some people raise money. And then there's a woman like Ann Rosenberg, who lived in New Jersey, no connection to Pittsburgh. She was in Harrisburg that day, so a few hours closer to Pittsburgh, with her 6 dachshunds, who were all trained therapy dogs. And she thought, I wonder if they could use my dogs in Pittsburgh. And she found a friend of hers, or a friend of a friend, who was a nurse at Presbyterian Hospital in Pittsburgh, and she said, if I bring my dogs in, are there people at the hospital who would want to pet the dogs, hug the dogs? And the friend said, yeah, bring them in. And so she left Harrisburg, where her dogs were at a show. She yanked them out of the show, gave up whatever medals they might have won, I assume, and brought them to Pittsburgh as support animals, therapy dogs. And that was everywhere in the aftermath. There were dogs everywhere. In fact, there was a local nonprofit called the Center for Victims, which has 3 trained canine advocates, as they call their dogs. And they brought them to every Jewish event in town that they could find. They were at high holiday. They were at Tisha B'Av, outside of the big, sort of conservative movement group communal Tisha B'Av. There was a little antechamber, little room, as there would be here, like outside in the foyer, where you could go pet a dog or hug a dog. So all year long, if you ever felt like you needed to de-stress by holding an animal, there were dogs there for you. So it's graphic design, it's money, it's food, it's dogs. It's everything. It's crosses for losses. It's a carpenter from Aurora, Illinois, driving in with his own carpentry handiwork. There are also celebrity visits. Michael Keaton is from the area. He was around. Tom Hanks came to visit. Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots and someone raised in an observant Jewish home, came to Tree of Life, came to pay his respects when the Patriots were in town to play the Steelers, and so forth and so on. So there are all these many different ways, all these concentric circles of ways that people help in the aftermath. And my contention in the book is that that's not accidental, right? This kind of thing happens everywhere there's a mass killing, but it happens much more often, much more effectively, much better. When you have a community that knows how to distribute that aid, that knows who needs it, who needs a challah, where do you put the public art? Well, there's an obvious business district where you put up those posters that say stronger than hate. If you compare Squirrel Hill to so many of the other communities that have been hit by mass violence, communities that often descended into acrimony, where when money was distributed to survivors, people fought over who got more money, where people with survivor's guilt sometimes killed themselves. There are suicides in the aftermath of mass killings. None of that happened in Squirrel Hill. When the Federation Committee set up to distribute the millions of dollars in aid that had come in, announced their formula for who got what, how much aid did you get if you were injured? How much aid did you get if you were inside the building and traumatized but not injured? How much aid did you get if you weren't inside the building but lost a relative? How much money did you get if you were on the premises but outside the building, right? This stuff is extremely contentious. And when the Federation announced its formula, everyone shrugged and said, okay, we'll accept that. That's an extraordinary accomplishment for a community. For a neighborhood to not descend into mutual recrimination, suicidality, mass depression, and in fact, fairly quickly to return, albeit in the age of COVID, to some sense of decent normalcy is an almost unique accomplishment. And it was my contention that it is because of the historical strength of Squirrel Hill, because it is this tight-knit, geographically compact, walkable neighborhood, economically diverse, with people who are quite wealthy as well as people who are quite working class, with a historic public high school that people use, with a business and commercial and religious district that has synagogues, churches, the public library, the public high school, the kosher market, the non-kosher market, the post office, all within, a 1 mile walking loop. That when you have a neighborhood like that when the worst kind of thing happens and people want to help each other, they're able to connect and able to do so in a way that allows that neighborhood not just to survive, but in some very profound ways to thrive. And I think that's the lesson of Squirrel Hill. Thank you. So all of those people are in the book: Tim Hines, Rose McKee. It has 60 photographs. That was very important to me, that it be well illustrated, because I wanted people to be able to see what I was talking about. And it was an extraordinary honor to get to spend time with these people who, again, were my dad's people growing up, but I had seldom been to Squirrel Hill as a child growing up in Massachusetts. What can I tell you? Are there any questions? What would you like to know about the book, the town, my research? Yes. Wait for the microphone so the people on Zoom can hear you.
Hi. Thank you for a wonderful story. It was
You're
very
welcome.
well told, too. My question is, how did you find out about all these people who were connected with this somehow?
I invented some of them. No, I'm just kidding. No, this is a nonfiction book, which, according to my 8-year-old, means I'm not a writer at all, because real writers write fiction. So I've had to promise that I'll write a novel to establish my bona fides with my own children. Everything's word of mouth for me. I started with a couple people who I knew in the community, just, people who are Pittsburghers, and said, because I do have some relatives there, and I knew of a friend, and I had one professional colleague, a fellow writer who was from there. And I said, I'm going, whom should I speak to? And they would inevitably give me 2 or 3 names, and so I started with a list of, a dozen names. And as I worked my way through that list, each person I talk to, my last question is always, who else should I talk to? And, as you can imagine, if you have any math skills at all, which I don't, but I have good enough math skills to know this, it grows exponentially very, very quickly. And I ended up with hundreds of names I never got to. But certain names kept coming up again and again. And if 2 or 3 people had said, you really have to talk to so-and-so, I would talk to so-and-so. But there are still loose ends. There's still, if I look at my notebooks now, there are people about whom I think, I can't believe I never got to so-and-so. I really should have talked to her. It's embarrassing that, it's hard I lie awake at night thinking about the people I didn't talk to. But I did talk to about 250 people. So I got around pretty substantially. But that's how I did it, word of mouth. Yeah, great question.
The Shever Kadisha, the 2 different paths to welcoming or taking care of the body after
Right.
it passed away were so beautifully written.
Thank you.
How did Orthodoxy look on what the Reform movement did after it was written? Because it was so beautifully done.
Yeah.
And it should be respected by everyone. And I wondered whether there was a respect afterwards, what they understood, what Reform Judaism and progressives do today.
That's a great question. So let me explain, if for those of you who haven't read the book yet. one of my chapters is about the, literally you would translate Chevra Kadisha as a holy society, but you could say burial society. The groups of the lay groups of Jews, they're not specially, consecrated, they're not priests, they're not rabbis necessarily, just, simple Jews who organize in these groups to do a proper Jewish burial, which begins with a cleansing of the body, which is called tahara, Tahara. So this is, historically, there's a Jewish way to bury a body, and it involves washing the body in cold water, removing all organic matter, making sure there's no blood left on the body, no excrement, anything like that, making sure there's no makeup. The body is buried nude but sewn into a linen or muslin shroud. There are traditional prayers that are said, psalms that are recited. A lot of this is tradition. It's not Torah. It's not prescribed in Torah, but traditions have grown up about how you do it. And it is and this used to be done by communities. Families buried their own. Or it actually wasn't your family, but communities buried their own. You wouldn't bury an immediate relative, but your neighbors, people from your congregation would have a Chevra Kadisha that would, when you died, that would quietly, without fanfare, show up. You didn't talk about the work. In fact, the members of the Chevra Kadisha are sort of semi-secret, because the idea is you're not supposed to, you don't want to be at Kiddush knowing that if you die next week, this is the guy who's going to see your naked body. There's a kind of modesty aspect to it, so it's kept very quiet. And in America and in modernity generally, a lot of that has been handed over to the funeral industry. So a Jewish funeral home is supposed to know how to do the basics of this. But in many communities, particularly where there's an Orthodox population, there is still a non-funeral home associated volunteer chevra that will do this. And there is in Pittsburgh, there's a very vibrant, robust holy society led by a guy named Daniel Wasserman, who's a rabbi there, who's actually making aliyah. He's been a major rabbi there for 25 or 30 years. He may have moved already, but they're looking for a new rabbi. But what's interesting about Pittsburgh is there's also a non-Orthodox holy society, which is very rare in America. I mean, there are a couple dozen, I think. It's less rare all the time because this is sort of coming back. There's sort of been a resurgence of interest in burial societies. And Pittsburgh is a place that has, they don't like me to call it the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox because they don't define themselves that way, but in practice, to be in Wasserman's Holy Society, you have to be, Shomer Shabbos and generally keep mitzvot in a way that's more typical of the Orthodox. And by the way, there's two, within the chevra, there will be the men's group and the women's group. Men bury men, women bury women. So, but there's also a progressive or liberal or non-Orthodox holy society called the New Community Chevra Kadisha, which has been operating for a couple decades in Pittsburgh. So when these deaths happened, both of the chevras ended up working with some of the bodies, depending on what the family's wishes were. Now, none of the dead were Orthodox. They were the three synagogues inside the Tree of Life building, because there was the landlord synagogue and two tenant synagogues that all lost members that day. It was a historically conservative synagogue, another traditional conservative synagogue, and then a Reconstructionist congregation. But some of those families wanted their relatives who had been killed to be given a tahara by the Orthodox Burial Society, and some used the non-Orthodox Burial Society, and some may not have used, I think almost all of them used one of the two. The other thing that the chevras did is they cleaned, you're supposed to bury all of the body, which means that if there's been a mass killing with, say, gunshots, and bone or blood have been splattered on the walls, you're actually supposed to collect that bone, the bone shards and the blood as best you can, and give it a proper burial. So this is other work that the two chevras collaborated in doing. So some of their work was done separately, some of it was done together. And I would say that in general, I was amazed by the amount of respect that the two, certainly in talking to them, the two chevras spoke of each other with great affection and respect, and there was a sense of cooperation. There have been historical differences between the two of them in terms of, for example, one of the chevras would not accept a convert who has had a non-Orthodox conversion into the chevra. The other one has such converts who have had Reform or Conservative conversions in their chevra. So they have irreconcilable and different philosophies, but I would say that in the aftermath of this killing, they worked together with a great deal of respect. By the way, I should say that, I'm so glad you asked that question. Nothing in my book taught me more. There was no chapter in which I learned more and came away more amazed and wished I could have had room to say more than my chapter on the burial societies. It is a chapter of Judaism that is alive and well in America, that is incredibly vibrant and beautiful, that gives a lot of people a road into deep spiritual practice who may not find it through prayer or Torah study or whatever. It was just, I'm overawed by what I learned about the Chevra Kadishas. So thank you for asking. Yes.
Thank you so much. You've described a beautiful community and a very devastatingly sad event. The way I hear you talk about Squirrel Hill, however, it feels unique. And I wonder how you can take what they learned and what they've done, sadly, to other communities who may be going through a similar tragedy.
Right, that's a great question, and I will give you an answer. I will preface the answer by saying that as somebody who's not a clergy person, not a rabbi, doesn't have to do the hard work of building Jewish community, Jewish practice, et cetera. You know, I'm somewhat ill-equipped to answer it because I'm not in the trenches, so to speak. I'm a journalist. I report on what I see. I try to be faithful to the actual events. I'm not somebody who does the kind of Jewish community building professionally that people like Rabbi Schwartz and his colleagues and so many rabbis, educators, cantors, lay leaders, and so forth do. So I always want to begin with a kind of profession of humility there, that really I'm not. It's easy for me to talk, but I don't have to do the work. What I will say is that the great advantage Squirrel Hill has is, comes down to two things. One is longevity, and the other is topography, is that they're geographically close. Longevity is really, really hard to work for, though I would say that, there are choices that I talk about in the book that Squirrel Hill Jewish leaders made about keeping the community in Squirrel Hill. Most principally, in the 80s and 90s, when a lot of their buildings that had been built in the 20s and 30s needed renovation or reconstruction, when they had to decide what to do with their physical plant, instead of rebuilding in the suburbs, which is entirely typical of Jewish communities in America, they rebuilt in Squirrel Hill. They took a leap of faith that if they kept in Squirrel Hill or Oakland or Regent Square, the sort of neighborhoods in the east end of Pittsburgh, which are all pretty contiguous, if they kept right there, the JCC, the Jewish Home for the Aged, Jewish Family and Children's Services, the social work agency, the day schools, and the shuls, that Jews would continue to live there. And they were right. Now, definitely there are a lot of Jews in the suburbs these days. A lot of them drive back into Squirrel Hill for stuff, but they have kept a basic stability largely because they kept the heart of Jewish Pittsburgh's infrastructure there. I don't know if that would work everywhere, but that was a choice that the community made that took some risk. So that's number one, is you can plan for a kind of stability if you're willing to take the chance that it'll work. In terms of topography, I can't emphasize this enough. The number one thing, I think the rabbis will generally agree with me here. Again, I'm getting on my preacher soapbox here that I never earned. The number one thing that Jews need is to live near each other. Because when you live near each other, you're more likely to do stuff together. You're more likely to come to an event like hearing some author talk. You're more likely to come together for a shiva call when somebody dies. Leave prayer out of it entirely and just think of all the other things you might do together. In a book club, at a shiva call. You're more likely to bring a meal to new parents who have a baby and are overwhelmed and could use a Friday night dinner dropped off at their door. That's really hard to do if you have to cross the Bay Bridge on a Friday at 6 p.m. You're simply not going to do it, even though it might be 20 miles. You're not going to do it, right? And in some ways, the West has been enormously destructive to Jewry. It's very hard to have Jewish community in far-flung places. It's very hard to have it in Seattle, where the community on Mercer Island is so detached from the community that's not on the island. It's very hard to have it in the Bay Area. It's very hard to have it in greater Los Angeles, simply because of traffic. And, and in fact, historically, there are fewer Jewish neighborhoods There are fewer neighborhoods where you'd say, yeah, that's where the Jews go. If you want to be near a deli and a shul and whatever, go to that neighborhood. You actually find fewer of those in West Coast cities than you would in East Coast cities, because the topography is such that everyone's a few miles from everyone else. It's just they're not built for that kind of walkable, dense neighborhood in the same way. They're built for beauty, which is awesome in its own way. So it's very hard to say, like, how do you retrofit a Squirrel Hill model? It's easy to say how you retrofit a Squirrel Hill model into New Haven or neighborhoods of Boston or even neighborhoods of Washington, D.C., and a lot of them have neighborhoods like that. You'll find something like that in West Mount area in Philadelphia. You'll find like something like that in West Rogers Park in Chicago. You'll find it in certain New York neighborhoods, more and less so, to varying degrees. You tend not to find it in, it's harder to find in Denver, where I just was. But they, people do a good job. Here's what I would say. Given that it's harder to do in places where the traffic is bad and people live 10 or 20 or 30 miles from each other, the thing you can do to begin building to it is have people over to your house, right? Which is a kind of radical act in places where people live far apart from each other. But it all begins with, like, Judaism is a home-based religion in that way. And, we are a place where you don't need to do your religious practice in a special building. It's good to have a Torah scroll, but you don't need to consecrate a room. It's not like Catholicism or Mormonism, where certain places are consecrated. You have to go to the church or the cathedral. Well, you can do anything in your living room. So it kind of like Squirrel Hill is built. It's okay. You're forgiven. Squirrel Hill fundamentally is built out of people having each other over and knowing each other at a very home-based level. So to the extent that any community can just say, if you can get a community where everyone feels that 3 or 4 or 5 times a year they have to have over other people from that community for Friday night dinner or Sunday brunch or whatever, you actually have gone 80% of the way to having what Squirrel Hill has. But that is a habit that American Jews have lost. We expect our congregations to do the work of bringing us together for us. And I would say that in Squirrel Hill, they don't rely on their synagogues as much to do their community building. They're much more likely to have people into their homes. I'll say one more thing, by the way, which is really radical outside of Squirrel Hill. Squirrel Hill has much more intra-Jewish mixing, like Orthodox and Reform who are friends. And one of the things that's so remarkable there is how many people in the Orthodox community said, one of the guys who was killed was Jerry Rabinowitz, who went to the Reconstructionist synagogue in the building. I knew so many Orthodox people who had had Jerry and his wife over to dinner, and vice versa. That's pretty rare outside of Squirrel Hill. You don't see as much of that. So, or, whether they had them over to dinner or just knew them well or had them to lunch, they were in community with each other. So to the extent that you can have programs that help you get to know a Jew who's not your flavor of Jew, that Reform Jews can know conservative Jews and conservative Jews can know Orthodox Jews, that builds a lot of solidarity, because God forbid anything like Tree of Life ever happens, you need the solidarity of more than just the Reform community, right? You need the solidarity of the Jewish community.
I'm wondering if you spoke with some of the Jewish professionals, because there's also a plethora of like AJC and JCRC and like all the the different alphabet soup of Jewish organizations, and like just for me being slightly privy to that, it was definitely challenging for them. It's not like it was a piece of cake to figure out how they all work together, and some won and some lost in certain situations. Like, did you speak to those folks too? Because it's like to their credit for sure, even though it wasn't easy, that they all did work together.
No, I mean, the communal organizations I spoke most to were from the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. But I didn't speak to any of the national, in fact, spoke to almost nobody who wasn't from Pittsburgh. I didn't speak, you mean within Pittsburgh? I mean, I didn't speak to any of the AJCOM or AJ Kong or any of those. I mean, it was partly because, and I'm sure, I know that, everyone worked in concert really, really well. But one of the things that happens when you talk to people who are professionally certified Jews is they tend to talk like professionally certified Jews, and they're very careful. They're very on message, and they're much less likely to tell you the kind of deep story, whom they're mad at, whom they're happy with, who's fighting. They're very, and they often send you to their press office. They often say, why don't you talk to so-and-so who's our head of communications? And as a general rule, I don't really interview directors of communications, because you can get their press release. So I tried to work with people who maybe weren't professionally stamped in that way. But that said, I do have a big chapter on the Federation and the work that they did and the fundraising and the distribution of money, which I thought would be extremely dry and ended up being, I actually found quite moving.
I have a question.
Yes, Rabbi.
3 years later,
Yeah.
what's Squirrel Hill like today?
Well, I wish I knew more. I mean, because of COVID, Squirrel Hill is a lot like every place, which is, people for understandable reasons didn't see as much of each other. What I will venture is this: the great achievement. Some people say, is Squirrel Hill? The way I sometimes get asked that question is, are they still loving each other as much as they did in the immediate aftermath? Is there still as much solidarity? Are they still doing all the kind of remarkable events and healing circles and therapy groups? And my answer is basically no, because the great achievement is normalcy. People. I mean, there definitely are still groups that are meeting. There's stuff still going on, but you can't live in peak condition all the time. Your body wouldn't take it. You can't live in an adrenalized state of self-care, trauma response, massive love, showering. I mean, the Breslovers tell us to try, and the followers of Nachman of Breslov, right? Our commandment is to be living as much joy as possible all the time, because Hashem gave us this life, and it's a nice thing to aspire to. But in fact, as normal mortals, if we can just have normal, uneventful, simple, decent lives all the time, in which we generally don't feel terrorized, for Jews especially, that's a great accomplishment. And what I found actually so incredibly impressive about the people of Squirrel Hill was how well they helped each other back to normalcy. So it actually feels pretty much the same, but it could have been otherwise. It could have been that people stopped going to shul, or that attendance at the day schools dropped, or that social relations frayed, or that people were suing each other over money, or that there had been, suicidality. And in fact, there wasn't. In fact, what you saw is like a lot of Pittsburghers being Pittsburghers and doing Judaism pretty quickly thereafter. There is an annual event. There's always some memorial on October 27th, or sometimes on the Hebrew date in Kislev, which I now forget. I forget what the Jewish date of the killing was, but that, of course, moves around on our calendar. And there's always some sort of memorial. And this past year, now, of course, you want to bake in COVID, but even so, it was very poorly attended. And I think it will get even more poorly attended as time goes on. And I consider that a kind of great victory.
Raise your hands again so I can make sure that I'm getting it in order of appearance. Charlotte, okay.
So unfortunately, Squirrel Hill wasn't the last anti-Semitic shul shooting.
No.
And I recently listened to Dara Horn's book, Everybody Loves Dead Jews.
Right.
Where she says
It's a great book.
She has stopped being the person who writes a piece about it.
Right.
And so without wanting to be a downer, I'm wondering about your thoughts about Colleyville and the sort of follow-up events.
Right. Well, first of all, that's a great book. And if you read 2 books this year, the second one should be People Love Dead Jews by Dara Horn. And she's remarkable. And I think I'm on the back of the book saying it's one of the best collections of essays I've read in years, which it is. And yes, she is a deep critic of the sort of Jewish suffering industry. And her general point is Gentiles love reading about dead Jews. They don't really like reading about living Jewry as much. Which, by the way, is true. If you look at how kind of popular media at large and Gentiles deal with traditional, normative living Jewry, it's generally by ignoring it. I don't think there's one TV character on one, except for shows about Jews, usually Haredi Jews, like Shtisel or Srugim about modern Orthodoxy, Shtisel about Haredi Jews, except for shows that are about Orthodoxy. If you looked at shows that aren't principally about Judaism, try to find one character on any show in the history of American television who just is Jewish and lights Shabbat candles? Or is like, oh, it's Saturday, we'll do that when I get back from temple. It's almost non-existent. Occasionally there'll be a bar bat mitzvah scene, usually played for laughs, usually condescending to and ridiculing Jews. But basically, Jewish practice is almost completely invisible as a normal thing that normal people do from all of American and indeed all of Anglophone popular culture. But when we get murdered, or when you discover the diary of a girl who ended up getting murdered at Auschwitz, or when the community is dead now, Fiddler on the Roof, then all of a sudden it's very warm and Hamish and sentimental and nostalgic. So her point is very much real. And by the way, you can lay a lot of that at the feet of many secular Jewish writers and Hollywood producers. And I mean, it's not like Gentiles did that too. We collaborated in the erasure of our practice from American popular culture. That said, you asked about Colleyville and Poway. My general thought about this is perhaps ironically, given what I spent 3 years of my life doing, I'm fairly non-alarmist. The odds that any given Jew is going to be killed or the victim of a violent attack in America are still vanishingly small. I think that many communities are overspending on security in ways that will be wasteful and are not being particularly mindful. I think that it's a real shanda if a community finds $500,000 to improve its cameras but is still underpaying its preschool teachers. I actually think there should be a formula, maybe. I had this thought last week when I was talking at a different congregation, that there should be a formula for every X amount you spend on security, at least X amount or 2X or 0.5, whatever it is, has to be spent, has to be raised, and has to be new money spent on salaries for underpaid professionals. I mean, I think it's like unthinkable how communities that are paying the synagogue secretary $40,000 without benefits all of a sudden have $500,000 for cameras. Well, I guess if the money's there, why wasn't it a moral emergency to pay the woman at the front desk better? And it's usually women who are so badly underpaid. And so I think I have deep misgivings about the securitization of our shuls and how it's proceeding, even as I recognize that in many cases we can do a better job of, figuring out who's inside our buildings. So the other thing I would say about that is, and I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal and got attacked pretty widely for it, and I said that frankly, anti-Semitism is largely a problem today if you do Jewish stuff. If you choose to pass and assimilate into non-Jewish culture and if you're just carrying a Jewish last name, but are otherwise not Jewing it, no one's gonna keep you out of a country club for the most part these days. I mean, I hear urban legends about the law firm that won't make a Jewish partner or the country club, but that stuff is vanishingly insignificant in America today. If you just want to pass and let's lead a prosperous American life, a last name like Oppenheimer is not going to stop you the way it would have in certain respects in 1950, in terms of where you can live, where you can work, whatever. The anti-Semitism today is, God forbid you walk into a Jewish space like a synagogue or a day school, or look visibly Jewish on the street because of your payas or your hat or your wig, then people might scream at you or punch you or kill you. So I think that we as Jews who can pass easily have to really think about how we can be in solidarity with those who have a harder time passing because of their practice or their garb.
Thank you for your talk. Really, really interesting, and I married a girl from Pittsburgh, and so if you'll indulge me just for 1 second, because it goes to your story about the connection between the various congregations and Jews of all denominations, which I found to be unusual and probably sustaining for Squirrel Hill. Susan, we were at Columbia together, Columbia Law School, and I went to visit her family in Pittsburgh. They lived at 1363 Shady Avenue. So if you know where that is, it's kitty corner from Tree of Life.
Yeah.
The shul they belonged to was B'nai Israel, which was not in Squirrel Hill, actually.
Right.
But we were there for Passover, and our second Seder was at Rabbi Birkin's house, because Rabbi Birkin and my father-in-law were great friends, even though my father-in-law did not belong to and mother-in-law did not belong to the shul that Rabbi Birkin was the rabbi of. So I thought that was just a great example of how interconnected Pittsburgh was. And obviously, we're very shaken by the tragedy there. My question is, can you talk a little bit about the Trump visit, which seemed to be the one thing that threatened that interconnectivity of Pittsburgh?
Right. Absolutely. So there's a chapter in there about Donald Trump's visit. He came on the Tuesday after the killing. So the killing was a Saturday, and he came on the Tuesday, which was actually the day of the first funerals. The funerals were held Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So as they're trying to have shivas and, bury their dead, a presidential visit comes to town, which of course means massive traffic snarls. And there were definitely, there were people who thought he shouldn't come at all. There were people who thought he should come, but after all of the funerals are done. There are people who felt he should come as soon as possible because that's what presidents do. And there was a very large peaceful protest. One person was arrested for sitting down in front of the motorcade and meditating and blocking them, but not in a violent way. There were thousands of people there. One person suggested to me that it may have been the largest gathering of Jews in Pittsburgh history, that Donald Trump did what high holidays couldn't do. And, it is, look, Pennsylvania is a politically polarized state. Western Pennsylvania is especially politically diverse. Pittsburgh is politically diverse. It's largely Democratic, but with very strong Republican and conservative contingents. And that's true of the Jewish community as well. So it was, there was a lot of tensions ran very, very high. And, but what I would say is that it didn't fracture any congregation or that I knew of. It didn't fracture the community. I mean, people are very used to living with political differences within their community, which I will say, as somebody who has political beliefs and strong ones, I find it to be a virtue that they are able to have people of different political beliefs at their Shabbos tables and dinner tables. There are people who don't think that's true anymore, who think that anytime you fraternize with the enemy, the stakes are so high these days that anytime you fraternize with the enemy, you're somehow suborning climate change, misogyny, nuclear proliferation, whatever. And I actually just think that's mistaken. I think that the people of Pittsburgh, by and large, have it right, which is that actually the way out of whatever problems we have is going to be through trying to sort of pull back from polarization and reintegrate more. And they modeled that. So it was a very, very tense week. And the rabbi of Tree of Life did meet with Trump, which some of his congregants didn't want him to do. You can read all about that. But ultimately, whatever fractures there were, it reset back to whatever it was before. They sort of came back together. Yes, sir.
First of all, I want to thank you very much for the podcast.
You're welcome.
I don't wait breathlessly for it, but it's very, very interesting. I enjoy it a lot. So please tell Stephanie.
You are a member of, as we call our audience, the J. Crew.
I am a J. Crew member, yes, indeed. I have a couple of stars that say that I am. But my question is, with all the anti-Semitism that's going around today, what has the congregation at Squirrel Hill, have they become more active in trying to figure out ways to fight anti-Semitism, or where do people's heads go from that?
Well, so there are a lot of congregations in Squirrel Hill. Tree of Life, the three that were affected, I think, are all doing all they can to just kind of stay together, especially with COVID. They've all relocated to other places, at least temporarily. In one case, they've announced it's permanent. New Light is not going to come back into the Tree of Life building even after it's been renovated, which is, they're trying to raise money to renovate the building and clean up, but also improve the building when they do that. So I don't think there's been, they're trying to stay afloat and keep going. I wouldn't say there've been major initiatives to combat anti-Semitism. Look, the way you can combat anti-Semitism is continue to be proudly Jewish and to keep doing it, right? Broadly speaking, I will tell you that I actually don't think there's much point in spending a lot of time thinking about how to fight anti-Semitism. Anti-Semites are not, you can't reason with them. I mean, it's a sickness. Sometimes, like other paranoid sicknesses, it takes hold in society. Sometimes it rises and crests. It typically falls again, but we know this from Jewish history. I give them credit, I give most of us credit for not spending a lot of time thinking, what can we do to fight anti-Semitism? In some ways, that's giving in to the anti-Semites. Like, to make our lives and our Judaism about fighting anti-Semitism is to make it not about Torah and holidays and joy and family. So I think the work that they've been doing is to try to hold their congregations together and to stay in each other's lives. Is there a final question?
What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow?
Yeah, that I don't know. Fred?
Hi, I'm actually from Pittsburgh, and our son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren live there. I think one of the, and this is more of a comment than a question, but I think that the Jewish community in Squirrel Hill, because of its nature and the nature of all the other types of communities that are around it, and having to do with the topology of Pittsburgh, in one sense it's almost ghettoized in that you've got the Ukrainian community, you've got the Polish community, you've got an Italian community, the Greek, I mean, the numbers of different ethnic, religious, and whatever organizations and communities is incredible. So to me, Pittsburgh in itself is unique as a city. I've traveled a lot around the country and around the world, and I have yet to see a community or a city like it. And it filters through everything that goes on there. And I think that the strength that the Jewish community gets is felt through the way the other communities around there deal with each other and with the Jewish community.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great note to end on. I mean, Pittsburgh is a city of ethnic neighborhoods that have held their character longer than most ethnic neighborhoods have. But I also want to point out, and you're right, I agree with that 100%. So I'll say, as they say in improv comedy, yes and. The and is that, again, to a great extent, that kind of stability is intentional. People work for it. And, you know, people make choices in where they live and how they live. And I'm always flabbergasted. I hope I don't offend anyone here. I'll just speak from my own experience in New Haven. I live in a neighborhood called Westville, which is very like Squirrel Hill in that regard. I mean, it's smaller. It's not quite as Jewish. Historically, it was more Jewish. But it's got that kind of density and that kind of neighborliness where you really do know that you can go borrow a cup of sugar from someone. Hamishness. And I'm always astonished when I meet someone who's saying, well, I'm going to move out to Orange, which is a suburb, a couple towns, a perfectly nice town, where, you know, everyone's on a half acre and they live far from each other and they often don't have sidewalks and it's just got nothing like that. And these are people who've been really thriving in Westville. And I'll say, why? And they say, well, you know, I just need, you know, we have 2 cars now, so we need a bigger garage. And I'll think, you know, really? Really? Like, you have one life to live, and you're going to make your real estate choices based on the size of the garage? Or someone will say, well, I really like new construction. What does that mean? I mean, I guess. I mean, or, you know, the people who say, well, 1,800 square feet is not enough, but we're buying a house that's 2,200 square feet. So we're going to give up all the neighbors we love. And America, I think, is very sick that way. I mean, the average size of a new house is something like doubled or tripled. I mean, the idea that people can't live, you know, Squirrel Hill you don't get big land in Squirrel Hill. I mean, that's one thing. They're beautiful houses, but they often, even the mansions are kind of on a quarter acre, maybe half an acre. You can't get an acre in Squirrel Hill. But you get so much more. And I'm flabbergasted at people who don't see that. But, you know, to some extent that's America. We think bigger is better, and there's a kind of sense of, and we're also a country that's on the move. I mean, this is not new to the present age. You know, what ethnic communities have always done is started in the city, and then when you can get, you know, a detached garage and a pool, and they move to the suburbs. In some senses, these Pittsburgh neighbors are fairly exceptional. But in a lot of cases, it's because they realized they wanted what they had. There's a kind of stability and a kind of knowledge that what they have is worth cherishing. And I guess I'll just conclude by saying, I've never been anywhere where I've met as many people who left and came back. One of the things you see all the time in Pittsburgh is people who said, oh, you know, I lived in Argentina for 5 years, then I was in Israel, and then we came back to the States and I was in whatever, Denver, Charleston, Tallahassee, and then we had kids, and I thought, I want to raise them in Squirrel Hill. I mean, I met so many 2nd and 3rd generation Alderdice High School graduates. It's like you literally can't roll, you're 2nd generation Alderdice grad? Yeah. You literally can't walk down the street without bumping into someone who went to Alderdice, whose parents and often grandparents went there. They often live in the houses they grew up in, and the parents have moved into the mother-in-law apartment or the garage or the 3rd floor. It's like, but again, anyone can value that stuff they've just made a choice to value it. In any event, I do think there are lessons for all of us no matter where you live, which is that to not outsource our decency, to remember that congregations, when they're doing their best, pull us together, but then hope that we see each other during the week as well. And I think it's lessons like that that are so integral to the story of Squirrel Hill. Thank you very much. That's your.
First of all, I want to thank Mark for being here with us this weekend. One of the things that a good journalist does is ask questions. And sometimes those questions are those difficult questions that require sometimes difficult answers. Sometimes those questions are just questions of inquiry. And we are a tradition of questioning. We are a tradition that constantly asks questions. And when we ask those questions, it's not just about the question itself. It's about our ability to hear what other people say and hear those stories. And when we hear those stories, their stories become part of our stories. And when they become part of our stories, then we share them with others. So I appreciate you sharing this story, and I appreciate our ability to ask good questions and continue to do what we do best, which is struggle with tradition, struggle with community, and also embrace community and embrace joy together. So I want to thank you guys for coming this morning. A few pieces of housekeeping and announcements. For those who signed up on a timely manner, there are books of Mark's book that is on the table right outside the sanctuary building. Your name is earmarked in the book for you to see. There are also books for some of those individuals who are live streaming, and we will be emailing you and reaching out to you this week to make sure that we put those books aside for you. I do have a handful of books also available for purchase if you're interested in that as well. Couple of announcements. Since you're here, go give blood in the Oneg room.
You can actually give blood while reading my book. Distract you from the stress and pain of giving blood. I'm a very cowardly blood giver, so I bring a book when I give blood.
We like to multitask here at Shir Hadash. On Wednesday evening, we are having our Purim service and Purim spiel. We are back live and in person for our Beauty and the Beast Purim spiel. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. There are a variety of different other events coming over the next few weeks. We have our Caring Shabbat this Friday night. We have our Purim Carnival next Sunday. On March 30th, we invite you to come to our Adult Ed open house for a taste of adult education, and we invite you to have your voice be included in our planning for next year. I want to thank Charlotte Kibble, our chair of the Adult Education Committee, as well as all of our Adult Education Committee members for supporting this program, and it's so wonderful to see you again. And grab a bagel on your way out. Thank you. Have a great morning.